I'd like to welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 6th panel in our series focusing on strategies for working remotely. I'm Elaine Rayborn from Sandia National Laboratories and the series panel lead. And today, along with my co-moderators, Ashley Barker and Mike Huru, who is guest moderating for us today, we welcome you to spend the next 75 minutes with us, and our panelists will be sharing their experiences and lessons on what they've learned about working in a hybrid environment, and that is a blend of on-site and working remotely. And so today we're joined by Katie Antipas, David Bernholt, Mark Miller, Heya Nam, and Valerie Taylor. So I want to thank each of you for joining us. Now on the next slide, I just would like to remind everyone, because we have a lot of new people today, that actually we are all staff members at the Department of Energy Labs, and we're located across the country, and we are involved in the X-Scale Computing Project. The panel series was launched in April to facilitate cross-institutional dialogue and sharing during the pandemic, as we're all adjusting to working remotely and discovering new ways to conduct science and keep our research teams productive. And so on the next slide, I'd like to introduce the topic of the panel. And so this panel is on sustainable hybrid approaches. And actually what we're learning is that hybrid configurations really add complexity and often requiring that we unlearn certain habits. So let me explain what I mean. Before the pandemic, certainly, we were probably mostly in a situation of either being co-located at our institutions with our groups, or we may have already been in a hybrid situation where maybe we were co-located with our teams or groups, but then also had some members of our teams or groups who were working remotely. Now, if you look at the slide that I've prepared, the situation that we're in right now is one of mostly being fully remote. And what I mean by that is that each of us collectively is experiencing what it means to work remotely. And this is a very unique opportunity actually for each of us to think about what this situation has caused us to reconsider maybe about the way that we used to work before. So what have we learned that's actually going to help us when we move into a more hybrid situation? And so what I've noted here is that this fully remote configuration actually creates the least amount of conflict and the most amount of trust. And that's because we're all on equal footing and it's equitable. We're all experiencing the same kind of degraded communication channels. Now, moving into a co-located group situation, that's actually the setting where we have the most conflict and the least amount of trust. And that's mostly because if you think about, we always talk about silos and how hard it is to communicate and well across groups. So there might be great effective communication within the group, but it's communicating across those groups that makes it difficult. So finally, in the hybrid situation, and here I'm not calling it remote, notice I'm calling it co-located and dispersed, because this is really a configuration where we are co-located at laboratories or co-located in our institutions. And then we have members that are remote workers, but they're dispersed, they're part of our team. And so what is it that we're learning from this situation that we can take forward to really become more inclusive, to really be more inviting with our team members, to really think about the ways that we communicate and the way that we're teaming? How can we learn from what this situation is to be more productive? And how do our definitions of productivity change? And so these are the things that I think would be great to consider. The other point I'd like to make is that, you know, I know that it's been said before that computational scientists, software developers, that we can work remotely from any situation. And I would really argue that that is true only if certain conditions exist. And each of those conditions are different for each of us. So I'd like for us to consider that as well as we have our discussion today. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining. And I just want to say that it's my real pleasure to work with Mike Carew and to introduce him, our guest moderator, for today's panel discussion. It's really fitting that Mike guest moderate this particular panel to kick off FY21 or fiscal year 21. So Mike, with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine. First, let me just say a few introductory things, and then we'll go through the format and have the panelists give their intro remarks. First, I want to thank our organizers, Elaine and Ashley. I thank Ashley for bringing professional processes to what we're doing with this series. When we got started, we were responding to an urgent need back in March. We had, I think, our first one in early April, the Working Remotely series. And Ashley and I'm sure the people she works with have brought a real professional process to this. And then also to Elaine, who again has brought her professionalism to this and converted this from being an ad hoc interpersonal approach to being a science-informed disciplined approach from really the beginning of when we start planning one of these to the very end of it. So thank you both for your efforts in making this one possible and all the ones before this. The last thing I want to say before introducing people is the motivation for this particular topic. I'm considered a remote worker by Sandia, my employer, and I have been from the very beginning. And that's a true statement. But in the context of this conversation, what I've really been all of these years is a hybrid worker. I've been a person who works most of the time from my home office or at the university or in Minnesota, or I'm on site or at other meetings with colleagues. And so I've always had this ability to meet with people face to face periodically. And I think that part of my interaction has been incredibly important. In fact, I think in some ways, it's allowed me to be more connected to people than, say, your average staff member, who are not dealing with their immediate peers. So when I would go to San Diego in Albuquerque or California, I was intentional about meeting with people and having a deep update from them. And if you're working in a different building than somebody else, you may not get over to see someone, even though you're on site every day. And so this has always been something I've appreciated about my hybrid experience. And one of the concerns I have about our current situation is we were all kind of pushed into, myself included, into this strongly virtual full-time remote experience, with a few exceptions, people who go on site. But many of us are just, constantly in this mode. And I think for some, it's given perhaps a bad taste of what this experience could be like. And I think the knee-jerk reaction I've seen in some instances, and it's anecdotal, is that people just can't wait to get back on site, full time and back to the way it was. But I think there's an opportunity here because many of us are going to be in this hybrid mode even as we make our way back. To really take advantage of this hybrid approach. It can be incredibly fruitful in my personal experience over these more than 2 decades of doing this. And so I'm hoping this conversation, we brought in a set of panelists who we purposefully picked because they're not necessarily cheerleaders for one approach or another, but they have really informed opinion and experience of how they're doing their work and how they might see a hybrid approach work. And so I'll stop there, and just so we're going to do a brief introduction. We're going to do Q&A as it says here. Type your questions in the Zoom chat box, and then the moderator Elaine or Ashley will ask you if you'd like to unmute and ask your questions. So we invite you to ask it verbally if you want, or you can have the moderator ask on your behalf. And then if there's a chance for a survey afterwards, you can. And then we're going to make all of this stuff available. In fact, it is available already. So let's move on and get started with our first panelist. And I know Katie is on. So Katie, please take it away.
Hi everyone. So when Mike asked if I would be interested in being on this panel, I thought I actually probably should be listening to the panel instead of being on the panel. So I'm going to represent the side of the panel that is really challenged by working remotely and someone who is having a lot of lot of challenges, and definitely hasn't figured out. This is, how long do I have 1 minute, Mike? Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, a couple. Well, Elaine might know best. What's a good amount of time, Elaine?
I think, Katie, if you take maybe 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, that's perfect. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, on the right, this is a picture of my 1-year-old who just really loves the trash. And I think this was, I captured this picture while I was on an ECP call that, of course, was starting kind of early in the morning. We do have some childcare help, but when everyone's working in different time zones and you're on the Pacific side of the time zones, you end up getting up a little earlier for these calls. So what can I say about working remotely that hasn't been said? I think my strategies have been to make this successful have been, well, I don't know if it's successful, but my strategies have been to try to take walking meetings, because if you've been to Berkeley Lab, you get so much exercise just going from one side of the building to another, or going to the cafeteria, or walking down the hill because you missed the shuttle, or walking up the hill because the shuttle didn't come. So there's always a lot of activity, and I found that that's really limited in my current situation. And then finding those random conversations that we're no longer having. So as a manager, I felt like I had a really good like sense of what was happening in the facility. You know, I would just chat with people all the time. And now remotely, I feel like I have no ears on the ground. I don't exactly know what's going on. And so trying to set up some of these, they're a little bit forced, random connections, I think is really needed. I like the concept of having a somewhat hybrid approach. I think, especially in the Bay Area, we don't see that everyone wants to go back to coming into the office 5 days a week, partly because the commutes are so long. And so giving people 1 or 2 days at home seems like it could be a really good approach. But then trying to have at least maybe 3 days or a couple days where everyone is in the office at the same time, so you can have some of those face-to-face meetings. I think that can be something that we can explore. So maybe I'll just leave it at that, and we'll get some thoughts on the next from the next panelist, and I'll listen and learn.
Thank you very much, Katie. Let's move on to David Bernhold.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Bernhold from Oak Ridge National Lab. From my perspective, we, or at least I, have been in a hybrid mode for a long time. I've been at ORNL for 20 years now, and historically nearly all the projects that I've either led or participated in have involved multiple institutions and many people. So we've been sort of working this out over time. A few of the things that I found from these experiences, one is, I didn't put it on the slide, but you know, the technology to support this is getting hugely better, and you know, now even compared to 5 years ago is a tremendous difference in the quality of these kinds of interactions, and I think that makes a really big difference. A few things that I've really picked up on most recently: respecting people's schedules is important, trying to make effective use of everyone's time. So particularly when you schedule a meeting, stick to the allotted times, and you know, don't run over and things like that. Just before everybody joined, we were chatting a little bit, and there's at least one community that I've worked with for many years that has a real problem sticking to these times, and it drives me absolutely nuts. One lesson from the COVID experience is that this kind of goes back to the slide that Elaine showed. Leveling the playing field by making everyone remote is really useful. I had, for a while, I was managing a group. We had one remote person, and they were always at a disadvantage because, you know, if we remembered to include them, they were on a speakerphone, the audio wasn't good, blah, blah, blah. And it was always a challenge. And so I kind of knew this before we all went home for COVID, but I wasn't able to practice it, or didn't practice it, let's say. And that's something that I intend to improve when we start going back on a more regular basis. Communications tools are very important, and there's not just one. Different projects like different things typically. You need to use them appropriately and set the expectation that others on your project will use them too, and use them to convey the information that people need. Otherwise, the skills to use them will atrophy. We've already touched on this in Katie's discussion about how hard it can be to get to know your colleagues in a hybrid setting. When we have the possibility of personal interactions, going to meetings together, Mike talked about this as well, those are great opportunities that you need to take advantage of, I think. I have found it very hard for these kind of water cooler get-togethers and things like that. For a while, I had my admin just sort of picking times during the week and scheduling times to get together. I missed probably 75% of them because I had conflicts on my schedule, and we never got more than a handful of people to show up at those. So I think that's still challenging, and I don't have good solutions for that. And then one of the questions that were asked is what do we need from our management, from our laboratories? And I would say there's a lot that our laboratory at least could do to make things easier. Conference rooms don't support teleconferencing very well. When we all went home and it was obvious that things were going to change, I asked for them to start making changes to conference rooms because they were still having, the craft workers on site and things like that to keep them employed. As far as I've been back on site just a couple of times, as far as I can tell, nothing's happened with respect to that. It's hard to get the AV gear. I had to pay for these headphones out of my pocket because the laboratory considers them unallowable. Cloud services that we use for collaboration are hard to get, things like that. So that's kind of where I am. There's lots more to discuss, but I'll give the floor to others.
Thank you very much, David. Let's move on to Mark Miller.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm from Livermore Labs, and I live in Davis, so that's about 100 miles north of Livermore as you drive, and I've been working in a hybrid setting for pretty much my entire career at Livermore. When I am on site, I'm typically on site 1 or 2 days a week, although I have a number of colleagues at Livermore who are actually out of state that commute. Maybe they fly in and are here for a week, once a month, for example. That's a common approach. Another colleague flew in every other week from Oregon. So a number of colleagues are actually further away than I am and do sort of a hybrid approach as well. But I'm typically on site 1 day a week, sometimes twice. For my experiences, when I'm on site, I get a ton of energy from the people I interact with, and I basically have to plan a lot of my meetings when I'm on site, and I have to accept that my day is going to be pretty much interrupt driven the whole time I'm on site, and I welcome that. And the improvement or compensation for that is when I'm at home, I'm not very much interrupted at all, and able to make a lot of progress on coding tasks that I have. Early on when I was doing this, I really avoided advertising it at the lab because I know certain parts of the lab didn't necessarily offer this to their employees, and hearing about it, I was just concerned it would create issues. But of course, this whole experience of COVID this year, I think, has really changed everybody's opinion about it. And like David, I've been in a number of hybrid meetings where I've been in the only one calling in to a room full of people with a mic at a table. And although there's a massive improvement in technology, I agree with David on that particular scenario is not handled very well. And it would be great to see our conference rooms get upgraded with better mics and handle that. The only other comment I'll make is because another team member of mine also commutes from Arizona. She flies in once a month. When we changed buildings a couple of years ago, we just told our group leader, look, let's share an office. There's no reason for the organization, because we were all suffering from office space. They needed office space. They didn't have enough space. I said, well, let's double up. And so only one day a month would we normally wind up syncing up and actually being in the office at the same time. And we thought that was a small price to pay. But I really actually love the hybrid setting. I think it's the best of both worlds. And thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark. Heya Nam is next.
Hi, I'm Heya from Los Alamos National Lab, and I'm really excited to talk with you about how I suffer through the challenges. I I'm not like Katie in that I, struggled with this change in work mode, because I realized that basically I've created a portfolio of projects that made it so, originally I had chosen my portfolio of projects to, be because I was interested in them, or I had the opportunity to work with a diverse community, or also I've worked at Oak Ridge National Lab in the past, as well as Livermore. So Randall's my third lab, and I've, been here for almost 6 years. But I guess kind of all of that came together, and my project portfolio really is optimized for hybrid work settings. So even though I've been 100% on site prior to this situation, I have basically been optimized for hybrid work. And what does that mean? So kind of the pie chart on the right is my portfolio, and I work in nuclear physics. I work for BER, so biological and environmental research. I have an ECP project. So there's a lot of Office of Science work there, which is extremely collaborative, diverse, multi-institutional. I'd never see my collaborators. So everyone knows what my voice is. But even on the NNSA side, so this is Advanced Scientific Computing is what ASC stands for, and this is computing for the National Nuclear Security Administration. I would say, if I broke that up as well, that I spend part of my time doing work to coordinate Sandia, Lannel, and Livermore together, which means I never see my collaborators there either. And even on site at Lannel, because I work in a building that is hard to get to for most people without getting prior approval, that my work at Lannel is even remote as well. So really only 15% of my day was in person at Lannel prior to all of this. It was just that 15% was spread across the, every day of the week, which means I couldn't just go remote completely. So I had to be on site for those 15% meetings that would happen. So going remote was effective for me 85% of the time, and it was really the norm. And I had, it was largely because I knew how to use all the technology well, and I always have a backup plan for when things fail. A lot of my colleagues did not. They did not know how to do a laptop at home. So I watched them struggle and tried to be helpful, but they certainly had some issues. The things that I would love to go back for, on site for is that face-to-face spontaneous synergy that I get from, meeting up with people who are not in my projects, who maybe have something that's related. Sometimes I feel like I need to be in a meeting face-to-face with people to get my point across, because they're just not understanding what I'm saying. And that includes both travel and on-site time. I miss the time on site that includes the wasted time, because I feel like all of those connections are really important. And for the long-term hybrid setting, I hope that managers will make the remote work the norm. So set up the WebEx meeting first before you set up the room situation for the meeting in the future. Really, it's about finding multiple paths to connect instead of just the one path. And the last bullet point is, if you don't have a camera, put up a picture. But this is my first time using a camera for a video conference, because it is not in my comfort area to do this. Usually, and right now, even now, there's like chaos and fires and children and dogs and husband all like freaking out at the same time. So I'm better off without a camera. Right now, I'm like Moses holding back the sea right now. So this is a rare opportunity to see me on camera.
Very good. Thank you very much, Heya. All right, the final opening remarks are from Valerie Taylor. Please take it away, Valerie.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So I'm Valerie Taylor. I'm the director of the Mathematics and Computer Science Division at Argonne. And I've been there, I've been at Argonne about 3 years. And I just want to note my first year at Argonne, I worked remotely. And that is, I remained in Texas, in College Station, Texas, such that my daughter could graduate from high school. So she's my youngest. and I didn't want to take her out of that senior year of high school. And it was great because she did everything she could all in 1 year, her senior year. So it was well worth it. But working remotely, I was at the lab about twice a month, and I would come in on a Wednesday and be there Thursday and Friday, or depending upon what was going on at the lab in terms of major meetings, I tried to be there in person. And so it was just as was noted before by another panelist, being there in person, I just had back-to-back meetings because I tried to meet with as many people as possible. But I also tried to have time to what I call walk the halls. And that is have some time when you can poke your head into someone's office and you know if they're really busy and head down and you don't want to say anything, but you know, to stop in and say, hi, hey, how are you? How are things going? I think, you know, that's really valuable. And I'm finding now that, you know, with the work from home, so we have the ability to also go into the lab. And so I go in about once every week or once every 2 weeks, and it's a few people on site. So when I'm there, it's primarily, I'm on BlueJean or Zoom. And I really miss the ability to walk the halls. So now, because, you know, I think as Katie noted as well, you have to schedule those meetings. So you're either sending a text or, you know, saying if, you know, it's now a good time for us to chat. So it becomes cumbersome instead of just poking your head in. So I missed that part, but you find other ways around it between text and video conferencing, or actually just having a phone call. So that works just as well. And I would say here, another thing in terms of with the division, and that is to look at having, what we try to do is to have a 30-minute coffee chat in the division once a week. And with no schedule, no agenda, but just an opportunity for ad hoc conversations and to check in on how people are doing. We still have regular check-ins, like in some cases it's daily check-ins of sending out a doodle poll just to make certain people are doing okay if there's anything coming up. But I find the 30-minute coffee chats are really nice to actually just check in with people and see how things are going. One thing I also note is that some groups I found, especially when the weather is nice, actually will meet at a park for social distancing. And that's really nice. And we've been talking about it more to say if groups are meeting at the park, maybe use Slack and to send out a notification about that. There's also plans where people will have some groups to get together, some group competitions that have to do with sports or, you know, with different teams and how much time it takes to do a particular activity. So that goes a long way to help during these times. And I also find that, you know, I understand Anand about the video, but one thing I have to say is it's nice to see faces because you look at the screen and otherwise it becomes a screen with initials. And so I totally respect when someone says, I don't want video on. And sometimes, and this is what I may do, is turn it on for a few minutes and then turn it off. It's just nice sometimes to see the faces as well. And one thing I'll note too is during this mode as well, because now when we have, for example, all hands meetings, it's, you know, using video conference. And that is to try to have some things that are interactive. So, and this is still for me a work in progress. And that is to try to have some polls. And that way you're getting some immediate feedback from the audience. So with that, I'll stop. And one thing I did want to know, because I have the little figure, I felt like I should have one. I guess for me, and I commend all staff who have young children, because handling children at home and all the home life, it's a phenomenal feat to handle all of that at one time. So I commend you. For me, I have my daughter is here, actually taking classes remotely for, she's in college now. And so our precious commodity is that of the bandwidth. So right now, she's taking a low profile, and that is not using her video, so that way I make certain I stay connected. And when she has exams, I do the same. So we coordinate with the video, but yeah, so that becomes the precious commodity. So I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Nice comments. All right, so we moved on now. Let's start the panel discussion. We want to hear from you, so please, type your questions in the Zoom chat window. If you can type your first name, or if it's apparent from your byline what it is, and then put your settings on gallery view to see all the panelists. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a bit so we can move on to the next phase. All right, very good. And then, so Elaine or Ashley, do you want to set up questions? How is that best?
Mike, the question during Heya's opening remarks that really occurred to me that I was wondering and hoping that the rest of the panelists could comment on was her notion of really optimizing her portfolio. It seemed to me, Heya, that you were optimizing your portfolio of collaborations. And so I'm wondering if each of you can comment on that, please.
Well, I'll just comment real quick. When there are many, if there's many people in play in a particular team and they all have wildly different schedules, then it can be a bit of a juggling act. An example was before COVID, we wanted to have a team exercise, go do an escape room. We did this last year, I think summer of 2019. And finding the right day to do it was complicated by my schedule, my co-office mate's schedule, who's commutes from Arizona, and one other person who happened to be on military leave sometimes. So that can get very complicated when the whole shoot match has different schedules. And I think one way to mitigate that is, okay, maybe once a month or once a quarter, you have everybody agrees to organize their schedule so that they're on site at this particular week or this particular set of days that week.
Maybe I ask a follow-on that's related to that. So those of you who, so Heya has optimized your portfolio for that. Others, they've been on site. How much of your portfolio do you think can be effectively done remotely if if we now start going back, if that makes sense? Is there a portion of your portfolio that can be done that way? David, the answer is obvious for you. You said as much, but I'm thinking of others for whom it may not be so obvious, and Mark as well.
Can I just ask you to expound on what you mean by portfolio? You mean the set of projects that you are working on?
The set of projects that you can work on. Let's say today you were told you could go back, and you could spend some fraction of your time hybrid. What would be the maximum amount of time that you could be hybrid and still do your job effectively? Remote, maximum amount of time you could be remote and still be effective. I guess I'm thinking more along the lines of Valerie and Katie, where you've been used to, at least in the present years, being on site pretty much all the time, or traveling, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at least at NERSC, we've talked about a lot of people seem to think of the people that are local to a Bay Area, right? So they're not traveling from out of state, but they're local to the area, and how much time would they like to spend remotely? And I think what we're hearing is sort of like 2 to 3 days is where people head. And I mean, I can see how that that could work. I think one of the things we're trying to figure out is, okay, should we make, and I put it in the chat, should we make an on-site day, you know, and say, okay, everyone telecommute Monday, Friday, if you want, and or is it just going to turn out to be like a potpourri, whatever you say initially?
Yeah. How about you, Valerie?
I think a couple of things, because I think during this time, I think everybody's, you know, been addressing the challenge of working remotely and being productive as well. And I'll say being productive too and addressing challenges. But I think when things open up a bit more, I think we'll still be in a hybrid mode where I think some will return to the office, and I probably will be one of those to return, but others may not. And I think, you know, that's fine. And I think, you know, it depends on the individual as to what works well in terms of productivity, because I just know for me, I like the interactions in person. I you know, I work, you know, with looking at a screen and the video conferencing, but I know for me personally, you know, it works well when it's a group of us going back and forth at the board and things like that. So that works well for me. And so, you know, I can see the hybrid, but I think it'll be individual as to how things work in terms of your productivity.
Very good, thank you. What's our next question?
Well, let's see. One of the most recent questions we have is on if you have really found a good way to replace to just replace this idea of bumping into someone in the hallways. And I think that's something that we struggle with across communities. And so if you want to make a comment about that, there's some discussion about that in the Slack, or sorry, in the chat. And then there have been some questions about how do you manage hybrid when you have some folks who are more remote than others. And yeah, so it looks like walking the halls is something that's on everyone's mind right now.
I'll just comment on that real quickly. Again, I said earlier, I get a lot of energy from interacting with team members, and a lot of those interactions when you're on site are spontaneous. Maybe you go out to lunch, pass each other in the hallway. There's just, you're sort of on the pulse of what's happening within the organization when you're there. And there's just very difficult to do that virtually. What I do is I host a virtual hallway chat I started this back in the beginning of the year. I did it mainly because there were a few team members I knew that lived alone, and I wanted to make sure that they were, you know, we were interacting in some way, just socially. And that's continued. We still do it. It's not quite as spontaneous or natural as it might ordinarily, because it's scheduled, it's on the calendar. But we do it now. We have good conversations. It's a good way to interact. It's at the lunch hour, so no obligation to deal with work topics. And it does require a bit of moderation. It's not as though doing it in the virtual context, it happens anywhere near as naturally if you're all sitting face to face. There is somebody that needs to serve sort of a moderator role when you do that, and that's kind of what I do. Just making sure that each person there gets a chance to chat a little bit and maybe talk about what's on their mind.
Yeah, I've definitely found when we've had these little coffee break kind of things that there are people who will just sit there silently unless you try to invite them into the conversation. And some people, it's hard to get them to engage, and it's just their nature. But I feel you kind of need to try.
Any other thoughts?
Yes.
So,
and
So I think,
yeah, go ahead.
oh,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
Oh,
No,
so,
go
so I
ahead.
was just gonna, I put it in the chat, but I don't know if all the DOE sites are using this yet, but Mattermost has been phenomenal for, and I put Sandia, but it's actually phenomenal for Livermore and for Lanel. So we use it extensively, not only for our projects, but now I can reach out to my Livermore colleagues at any time and just be like, hey, how are things going? So I found it to be a really wonderful tool. And you know, the fact that it is approved for OUO and export control conversations means that I don't have to be quite so concerned with using a tool like Slack, which is not always approved at LANL. So if the other labs can get on it, then we would have this giant DOE communication mechanism, which would be awesome.
You know,
Yeah.
and I was just going to comment too about the coffee time chats, because I think also the size of the group matters as well, because this past summer I did that initially with our summer students. And so the first one, we had about 45 students, you know, on the coffee time chat. And, you know, and I just had it short for 30 minutes. So then, you know, so that the concept of giving everyone an opportunity to talk, if they talk for a minute, I'm going, oh, this, you know, so we, you know, the students were also very conscientious about time. So after that first time, I then reduced the, you know, coffee time chat with the students to be a group of students each week. And I told them I was rotating so that way we could have some good conversations with about, you know, 7 to 8 at a time and actually have discussions. So I learned my lesson too, that size also matters as well.
Yeah. Yeah, one thought that comes to my mind is that I'm hoping with hybrid that we can actually, you know, do more of this, you know, walk the hall kind of thing. Well, we can't really do it at all in a physical way, and I'm hoping that's something that returns when we do hybrid work again. Although again, as Katie mentioned, there are logistic issues with that. Then that, you know, who's on, you know, are you going to be on site when all the people you want to accidentally bump into are also on site? And somehow we might have to figure out how to structure things so that we can improve the effectiveness of who's on site when. And anything else on that? Otherwise, we can move on to the next. Go ahead, Elaine. Is there anything else in the chat that you want to bring up?
Sure. There's a question on for those living far away from the office. Let's say COVID lets up enough for locals to go back to work, but not enough to permit frequent trips for those that are remote.
Right.
How do you think this affects your remote work efforts?
Good question. Any thoughts on that?
For me, I think it continues as usual. I'll say this. I started, I was driving back and forth between Davis and Livermore for many years. And actually I rented a room out in Livermore to stay overnight for many years. I ended up spending more than a year's worth of nights away from my wife at some point, and I didn't want to do that anymore. So did a lot of driving, more driving. And then I just, if you've ever driven in Bay Area traffic, you'll understand me when I say that is just so incredibly stressful. So I started taking public transit, and it's a 3.5-hour commute for me to get down to the lab starting at 4:30 in the morning, and a 3.5-hour commute to get back. That's an Amtrak train, a BART train, and a bus. But you might think it's crazy. I absolutely loved it. I love that. And so getting on site one day a week and getting back, that would be problematic now under COVID because I wouldn't want to take public transit. So I'd actually drive now for sure when I did go on site. But to be honest, as far as my productivity as a developer and as a providing customer support, it's actually a little more effective offsite because I can, when I'm on site and a customer in another building's talking to me, I have to set up time to make transit between buildings, basically meet them at the right time. Maybe they got other stuff going on in their office. Whereas I can jump on a Zoom call, I can send them a link and we can be chatting, looking at each other's screen in 5 minutes when I'm at home. and get stuff worked out. And often I use that technique at work because it's just fundamentally easier. So I do find aspects of remote work actually much better than they are being on site.
I go back to David,
I think,
one of David's original, oh, go ahead, David. I was going to quote you anyway, go ahead.
oh, well, I'm not going to quote myself, but, you know, I think one of the changes that I've encountered is the recognition that we really need to let everybody be remote. And so we need to, you know, make that the norm, so that when people are on site, maybe that's a special occasion, kind of when they can be physically co-located in some way, special occasion. Because, you know, just to get to the question that was asked in the chat, it's, you know, I think we have to continue accommodating these people who are remote and maybe can't travel or choose not to travel. And I think it ends up being a better strategy in the long run anyway.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to quote you about, David. Yeah, I wanted to reinforce David's comment about, you know, if you have some people, and Elaine brought this up in her model in one of the first slides, is, you know, I've actually left projects where, you know, I was one person or one of a few people who was remote, because there were, and everyone else was in the conference room, because there's so much nonverbal communication that goes on, that you really are not a first-class citizen on the team. And I know people who still say, well, gosh, but it's just so important to have meetings face-to-face. And yes, I get that personally, but I think that for the effectiveness of the team and the team building, you really need to respect the fact that people are remote and take that into account. I think it's more damaging in the long run for a team when you have, you know, when you basically, the nonverbal message is, you know, we care more about a few people who can be face-to-face than we care about the team as a whole. Even if it's not intended that way, it really can be interpreted, and if it actively is that way. So.
Yeah, I used to get upset when I would schedule time for the people to get together in a conference room and then get on the phone with the rest of the project group outside, and people didn't show up. And I've learned that I have to not be upset about that. That has to go away.
Yeah.
Right. But, and here's a question too, because I think, Mike, you brought up a really good point about, you know, even when we have what would be, you know, it's unclear what's going to be the new norm, but you still have, with a group setting, it'll be hybrid, because you'll have some people where it's on site and some people remote. And one question that comes to mind for me is, will this experience of, you know, having a period of time where everybody's remote make us more, you know, conscious of that, of being inclusive when we do have the hybrid meetings? And that is recognizing we're in the room, but you have, you know, those who are remote, and you're giving everyone a time to engage, and also you're conveying what's going on in the room. So it's not where anyone feels left out, you know, of the conversation. So it becomes where you really have to go that extra effort to make certain about everybody feeling inclusive, you know, in the discussion. Yeah. And it's almost where you're doing some of that now, you know, because you want to go around and make certain everyone has an opportunity to speak when they, you know, when they want to, and they're given that opportunity, but you're managing that, you know, in that virtual setting. So, yeah. You know, so you wonder if we'll use that going forward.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but another thought that came to mind about, you know, water cooler type or you know, incidental meetings is, if I have a meeting or a phone call with somebody I haven't spoken to informally for a long time, I'd like to take an extra 15 minutes or so and just have a conversation with them if it's been a while. And that's, you know, another way of taking advantage of impromptu opportunities. So what else is in the chat that we can address?
So Mike, this is Ashley. We have some technology questions. A few people have asked, you know, what do you think is missing in the current remote tool set that might make things better? Or do you have tools that you suggest that maybe are not mainstream we've all heard about?
Yeah, great question.
Has anyone used Miro? I've heard. What I haven't figured out is how to create like a good whiteboarding session where it's not a Google Doc. I've heard something about Miro where you can scribble and have an arrow and sort of have a messy chalkboard-like environment.
Oh, yeah, have not. That is a consistent identified missing element, that, you know, we don't have this, you know, effective tools for a shared whiteboard. And I'm sure someone's working on it, and maybe there are somewhere out there, but it has been a persistent need that hasn't been satisfied in the same way. And of course, that, you know, what can work at one lab may not work at other labs because of, as Heya had mentioned, right? You know, Mattermost works in her setting in many people's, whereas a lot of people use Slack, but it's not an appropriate mechanism for a lot of teams.
Yeah, the whiteboard, the other problem with whiteboards is that the interface can be problematic, right? You can't really do what you want to do with a mouse and a keyboard. You need some way of drawing, and not everybody has that.
And maybe the best thing is just a camera pointed at your whiteboard, you know, and trying it that way. It's not a shared whiteboard, but at least it's, you know, it's something, half of it. I don't know. That's a tough one to solve.
So I remember that in a previous panel, Jay Billings talked about doing exactly that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other tools or processes, technologies that people have used that may not be widely known to everyone?
I enjoy using multiple technologies at once. And this is something that I learned from ideas-ecp. It wasn't something that I had done previously, you know, where we not only do the Google Doc, but then we also have the video conferencing and some other, you know, connection capabilities, so that everyone was constantly doing something at some time instead of just, you know, sitting there and ingesting. We were all kind of actively working together on something. So I enjoy the multiple layering of technology.
Yeah. Yeah. One thought that came to my mind when Valerie was talking about meeting with students is I teach a bit, and you know, the university has Zoom, so we use that for communication. And one of the things you can do is create breakout rooms. And so, you know, if you have a lot of students, for example, I'll put them all into breakout rooms. I'll create teams at the beginning of the course. And then, you know, part of the class, they'll just spend talking. I'll give them an assignment, and then I'll drop in on them and kind of round robin through the teams. And it creates a really nice dynamic. They get to know a few students really well, small groups, 4 or 5 students. And I don't know, I think that, you know, the video conferencing technology with, you know, these breakout capabilities can be a really effective means of creating that small team communication, but still allowing you to scale to larger groups of people.
Yes, I agree. I've seen that used with where there were multiple moderators also going out to different breakout groups and then coming back together, that's worked well. Yes, and someone put something in there, you know, when we were talking about the whiteboard, because I've done that with Notability on the iPad, and then connect through there and share your iPad and work that way. And others on the call are going, no, here, go back up. And
that works really well for me. Works really well for me. And Notability is nice because there's a Mac app that you can export your drawing as a PDF and then just email it out.
You know, I'll just hearing someone mention students, maybe Valerie, both Valerie and Mike mentioned students. In my mind's eye, I'm thinking of students that my wife actually works with, and these will be elementary stage students, but I'll just mention it. There's actually a ton of really cool apps out there that allow you to create these really engaging and synchronized with something that you're doing. So you can have a conversation with your avatar, or do all sorts of other interesting things. So if you're thinking of someone, you know, in the age, K through 6, K through 8, maybe you can actually, and I'm thinking STEM events, for example, it's a very useful thing to be able to use that as a part of a STEM presentation, which I'll mention it because I'm thinking about it as being able to do STEM presentations, for example, at Livermore has gotten easier as a result of this situation, because a lot of the schools want you to attend, but you're going to be attending remotely anyway, so you don't actually have to travel to schools to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of, I think one thing that is being revolutionized is the whole notion of webinars, you know, seminars being webinars, and the opportunity, you know, if you're a center and you have a researcher, we can't invite them on site right now. But why let that stop you from hosting them, having a webinar and setting up, you know, a sequence of meetings, you know, small team meetings? You can still, you know, create a similar kind of experience as if they had flown to visit you and spent a few days. I would hope that we could continue that even as we go to this hybrid mode, you know, because you know, the opportunities for exchanging information are there, right? The tools are available. I usually attend the Smoky Mountains conference in Tennessee, the annual meeting, and of course it was you know, remote this year. There was one really nice talk. After the talk, you could raise your hand virtually and then go into a breakout room with the speaker. I had a fascinating hour-and-a-half conversation with that speaker, the speaker's colleagues, and then one other person, random attendee. And we had a great 5 people in this intensive 1.5-hour conference. And I was able to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner at my house. And I consider that to be a success.
One of the things I've noticed about when we transitioned to doing webinars instead of in-person seminars at Ornell is attendance jumped significantly. Yeah. It's easier for people to get there. They don't have, the room isn't full. They don't have to go find the stupid room, you know, whatever the excuse may be. And so I've routinely seen, you know, sort of double the levels of attendance that we would get in any seminar on site. And I think that's a good thing. We've been, at Ornell, we've been doing a lot of seminars kind of after we figured out we needed to keep that kind of thing going. We quickly transitioned to doing that.
Thank you. Yeah, great stuff. Yeah. What's next? Anything else from the chat? We haven't let anybody from the audience speak their question. Is there anybody out there who wants to try? You can ask.
Mike, someone plus one the question that I had. It's Elizabeth. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, Elizabeth.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Great. So the question that Elaine wrote and that I plus one was, how have your notions of productivity changed during this pandemic, if at all?
Great question. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll circle back to, for me, a little more connecting with my team. The bulk of my day is writing software, writing code, or maybe writing some web content. And so that's how I feel like I'm being productive when I'm doing that. But the fact of the matter is, the team cohesion and overall just general mental health has required perhaps a notch down in that and a notch up in just interacting with people, for example, in a virtual hallway chat, or over a longer meeting, or through longer GitHub conversations and issues that people are having with software. So there's been at least a sense on my part that it's important to kind of be a little bit more, make a little more effort to connect with people, a little more effort to be helpful to people under these conditions.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think you need to accommodate people more, especially, it's, there's a lot of different reasons that people can have more interruptions and distractions when they're working at home. I hear a lot of people saying, oh, sorry about that on a call and things like that. I think we just have to kind of accept these things and not worry about it and not make people apologize all the time, and realize that, if you've got kids at home and you're having to help them sometimes with whatever or things like that, that there may be some distractions and people may be working at odd times to make up for that or whatever it takes. So more flexibility and recognition that people aren't necessarily right on top of things exactly when you want them to be.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I agree wholeheartedly with David about the recognition and the flexibility, you know, and being dropped from calls as well. But yeah, and it takes that extra time. But I also find that I have some days, you know, I think because I don't have, oftentimes if you're in person, you have a meeting and you have that walking time between meetings. And now I end up with meetings that are back to back to back. So by the end of the day, you're just exhausted by the end of the day. You know, it's so you just end up with a constant meetings. And yeah, so trying to figure that out of making certain to schedule that in there, it's harder. I think it just becomes scheduled in there when you know you have to walk between meetings because there's no other way to get there. But now it's the next meeting is only a click away. So yeah.
Early on in the pandemic, I heard, you know, someone said that, you know, we're all in the same storm, but in different boats, and, you know, and how we experience it because of that. And, you know, so for me, productivity in some ways has improved dramatically. It was this director role for UCP. I was doing roughly, you know, 30 trips a year. And so for me to be, you know, stuck at home, if you will, which I haven't minded, honestly, has given me a lot more time to focus on things that I just wasn't able to take on, especially kind of longer attention span things, you know, because I spend, when I get back from a trip, I'm just taking care of what absolutely has to get done. And even during the trip, doing the same thing. And so I even had on my performance review, someone write a comment and say, yeah, it's been great to have Mike around a little bit, you know, because he can contribute to a project now and then. So I've in a sense, you know, experienced a bit of a productivity improvement, although who knows what the costs are associated with the lack of those trips. But on that hand, I've been in meetings in you know, Zurich and Tokyo and all over the US in one day and not have to leave my chair. That's, you know, that's pretty cool too. You know.
Yeah, the flip side of that is being, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as a parent with a small child in the background and several dogs and a very noisy husband who makes a bad office mate, I would say, you know, I have to be very forgiving to myself on if there are days when I am not productive. But I do notice my overall productivity is higher just because I can get to my desk earlier, you know, because I don't have a commute. I've built in a commute. Where I have to walk the dogs in the morning, and then I can listen to my news channel of choice. And so you know, I try and do those things, but it certainly is very difficult being productive and you know, with all the distractions. So reading a paper is like impossible, but I can do all the emails and get all the connections done. So I just have to balance when I can do certain activities and when I can't.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, maybe I'll just pick up the rear here and say I am definitely less productive. I think I'm about 80%. And so what that means is the days are longer, and then I send emails. I think my ECP colleagues may get them at like 3 in the morning because I'm sending them like at near midnight Pacific time. And so, you know, I think I've learned out for other people too, you know, you have to give people a break right now. I'm also hoping once this is over, that flexibility that people need in their family time is not going to be such a big deal, right? If someone wants to leave a little earlier and see a soccer game, that it's not going to be a taboo anymore. It's like, yeah, we were doing that for a whole year. So, so maybe there can be some improvements in the way that we support people and families after this.
Great comment. Good job on the hair, Heya.
I told you, there's only so long I can keep the floodgates back.
It's just great. It's lovely. Good job. All right, what's next?
So it seems like there's a theme in the chat. So we've talked about technology, we've talked about maybe how things have changed, but maybe does anyone have any really good tips on managing your teams? Besides, we've talked about coffee hours, we've talked about lunches, going to parks, but are there other tips or other tricks you're doing to try to manage your team during this time?
Great question.
Well, when I was a manager, I had regular meetings with a lot of my junior staff, just standing meetings, sync up. I tended not to have them with my senior staff because usually we would have just drop-in discussions about things. One of the things I found was I had to schedule every bloody meeting. And I hate it, but it's necessary.
David, have you tried using something like Slack or I don't know if Mattermost has this feature or not, but where you can just basically call somebody, do a quick video call, kind of like, we use it for incidental communication. I'm just curious if you ever tried that.
Yeah, Ornell, one of the many changes Ornell made right around the same time we went all away for COVID was they switched to Teams, Microsoft Teams, which has that capability as well. I have not really used it. I've been the recipient occasionally of such calls, but not very often. So yeah, that's something that could probably help, things like that.
Yeah, okay, just curious. Yeah. Other thoughts from the managers in the crowd?
Right. I found Slack to be, I've used Slack and actually initiated calls and also shared documents. And you have the ability to actually do some writing on a document. It doesn't stay, but at least you can take note of the document, which is really good. But I think, going back about groups and looking at the productivity of groups, I think, it still goes back to, going the extra mile to see how people are doing and being flexible. That helps to add to the productivity of the group. So, and that is, so we have some research group meetings, but we may spend the first, 10, 15 minutes or the last 10, 15 minutes just the check-in to see how people are doing, just that ad hoc conversation that helps, and then go into in-depth in the research, but that part really helps.
Very good. Well,
Valerie, that's a really interesting point that you're making, and I think we've been really talking about some of this, and it really gets down to trust. And so I'm wondering, we haven't really asked that yet, but other than what's already been mentioned about ways to bring people into the dialogue a little bit more, equalizing the communication environment, what are maybe some specific strategies you all have on really building trust in your teams? If you'd like to comment on that, that would be fantastic.
Well, for me, a couple of new people have been hired that I work with directly and have been involved in one-on-one pair programming activities with them. Didn't know them until I sent them a link they had contacted me in email. They're having a problem with a piece of software I support, and they sent them a meeting link, and we got to know each other over several meetings, and that's worked out really well. But as far as people on my team, I'm just trying to be more helpful and trying to be, responsive when people are asking for help. Like, how do I go about, and I'm talking about coding help, for example, maybe help with technologies like WebEx or whatever it is. but it just being more helpful. So that circles back to the productivity question as well. I do measure more of my productivity now by how much I'm enabling others to get work done than I might have if I'd been on site with people. And that there's that, you know, just trying to be as helpful as possible. Maybe just because you know other people are struggling with whatever, or maybe you don't know what they're struggling with, but you just know everybody's struggling with something.
So I was looking at the chat, a question that got plussed up, more statement, just wondering about remote work. Oh, now my screen just jumped. Where did it go? Remote work and making daily logistics easier when you have mobility limiting disability. Any thoughts on that? This reminds me of a broader thing of where people perhaps have, you know, so as I said, I did a lot of traveling, and I saw that there are people who just because of their personal life couldn't do that. And so they were essentially eliminated from certain kinds of roles in the organization, because in order to have the right conversation, you know, and to get the right point across, you often had to travel somewhere and meet somebody and make a point of making that point to them in person. And that, I think, is something that, you know, can limit careers if you can have that opportunity. And that disability, if you will, a structural one, is now missing. And I think, you know, there are lots of these things. I'm reminded of a company called Ultranauts that was in the New York Times, I think, recently. You know, they hire people who are on the autism spectrum. They, you know, 2/3 of their employees are on, and yet they're, because of their very flexible approach to communication, allowing people to express how they like to communicate, made it possible. All of their employees are remote. They have been from day one for 7 years. And does that offer us as a community an opportunity to be more inclusive, you know, to people by being more flexible in how they engage in their work life?
I think so. I mean, one thing I've certainly learned is to go to some reviews. I mean, we have a lot of reviews in the DOE space. You know, it takes a day to get there, it takes a day to get home, and then maybe there's a 3-day review. And I've actually been part of a number of virtual reviews that I think have gone as well or better. And part of the reason is that we've been able to bring, you know, sometimes there's just an expert you want for 20 minutes, right? Yep. And then you're able to bring that expert into a breakout room. Your breakout rooms are actually, your breakout discussions are better because you have more of the experts there, but they don't need to travel and be gone the whole week. So I'm hoping there's some things that we don't go back to, you know.
I agree, absolutely agree.
And then we keep those in-person meetings for where there's a lot of exchanges, but yep. You know, we don't go back to everything that we did in person, just to reduce some of the travel burdens.
And I think even when we have the in-person meetings, it could be hybrid. So you could still, you know, instead of being all or nothing, we can still, like you said, Katie, and that is bring people in maybe remotely in terms of an in-person meeting, such that people are still able to participate even if they can't travel to that meeting, that we see the value, you know, of it and continue that aspect.
But I think we have to put pressure on our institutions to upgrade the conference rooms and other facilities so that they can really support that effectively. I can tell you at Oak Ridge, the capability to do that is very, very, very limited. Yeah.
It's even worse at Lanel.
I bet.
Oak Ridge is really nice in my view.
So I'm looking at the clock. I think we were targeting about 75 minutes for this. Should we wrap it up or take one more? Is there one more question that hasn't been themed that hasn't been addressed yet?
So there is a disability theme in the chat where someone said, you know, for them it's been really good, and but I do think it goes both ways. And so we were just talking about how it might be that we need to get some closed captioning services because we have a lot of people who attend that can't hear this conversation. and so, or will struggle to hear it. And so I definitely think that's something we should all think about as we move forward too, is making sure we have that available. Like, we don't have it available here on this call today, and we probably should.
Yeah, very good point.
And that's a good point, because we held a conference that had a virtual platform, and the accessibility was a big issue of having, in addition to, you know, having captioning, but also having screen readers for those who are visually impaired. And many of the platforms, I learned, are not set up to provide the metadata that's needed for screen readers. So it's an important aspect too.
Yeah, very good. Well, unless there's something more, I think I'm going to put the slides back on, Elaine, here, if that's okay with you.
Can I just make a quick plug for the other labs to maybe, you know, push for this as well? But LANL has taken this opportunity to create a teleworking pilot to really dig deep into what is needed to support a remote workforce. So I'm hoping the other labs will also do something similar. They have about 1,000 people participating, which is a good chunk, you know, to come up with the processes, practices, technologies, and get something into place for a long-term impact from all of this.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, Sandia has a virtual worker policy. It's had it, it's evolved over the many years, but there is one in place, and a lot of people take advantage of it.
I was surprised to learn that Livermore has a small set of reimbursements that they're providing for workers that are incurring additional costs that they weren't expecting, either networking through their cell phone or other logistical issues that they've incurred as a result of remote work that they're supporting now, which is nice to see.
Yeah, very good. All right, I'm going to put back the slide here. Quick, and you can do that.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to thank the panelists and thank everyone in the audience for your participation today. I think the questions have really been very thoughtful. And so for that, we really appreciate it. And I think we've had a theme today, which is really about helping that remote work situation become less invisible, less second class, and moving it to really a position in the organization where it can really be leveraged, you know, for ways that we are redefining what productivity means as we start to incorporate new tools and new technologies and combine them with, you know, face-to-face communication. So just to close, we have a lot of resources available in the Better Scientific Software site. David Bernholt, panelist, he's on the editorial board with Riku Gupta and others, and manages that for us. So I encourage you to definitely check it out and to also contribute. It's been a pleasure to host this panel discussion today. So thank you, Mike, and Ashley and I thank you very much. And we thank all the panelists for your participation. And we thank you attendees as well. So I hope you all have a pleasant afternoon.
Thank you very much.